Hello and welcome to the fourth webinar of our series on youth employment and politics in Africa and the MENA region. Thank you very much for joining us this day. My name is Marioke Oosterom. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK, and I will be chairing the session. And this webinar series is part of our IDS strategic research initiative that is focused on decent work and inclusive politics for young people. And today's webinar is about youth, peace and security. And this is a major theme for research as well as international policy, which is why we have speakers and discussants from both fields today. And just last year, the international community celebrated the 5-year anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 2250 on youth, peace and security. And youth participation and inclusion in peace building is central to the resolution and policy agendas globally and also in individual countries. Much progress is made, and many will agree that there is still some work to do. And today's webinar builds directly on the previous one on youth politics. If you couldn't make it last month, you can still see the recording on YouTube. And like in the previous webinar, also the speakers today will highlight some of the challenges for thinking about youth participation, and now in relation to peace and security at international as well as the very, very local levels. And Ali Altiok will, for example, speak to the risks of securitization, but also romanticization of youth participation at international levels. The importance of formal and informal participation is again highlighted today, with some forms of informal youth participation not immediately recognized as peace building. And especially Sophia Shabab's presentation will speak about some of these very informal ways of peace building in relation to preserving heritage in Iraq. And then another challenge is how youth are seen and how youth participation is then seen. And there continues to be this binary in seeing youth as either peace activist or violent. And this is problematic as a lot happens in the middle. And many young people have combined both peaceful and different, more adversarial strategies. And where conflict emerges, the label of angry youth is quickly used, which may then ignore the deeper structural causes of conflict. And this is something that the third presentation today by Salvador Foquia will talk about in relation to Mozambique. But also at the other far end, seeing youth as inherently or only youth activists is problematic because that might overlook some of the challenges that they face in negotiating the very difficult situations that they're in. So we'll soon get started. This webinar is recorded like the other ones, and it will be available on the IDS website. We will first listen to 3 presentations and then the reflections by 2 of the discussants. And we then open up the discussion to the audience. You can type your questions and comments in the Q&A window or in the chat. We will hear all the speakers within 1 hour, and those interested to continue the conversation are very welcome to stay for another 30 minutes. And it is my pleasure then to introduce you to all the speakers. Our first speaker is Ali Altiok, who currently works as the Youth, Peace and Security Project Officer at Interpeace. And he has long worked as an independent researcher and advocate on youth and peace building. For instance, he co-authored a global policy paper on youth participation in peace processes for the UN Secretary General Envoys on Youth. And he worked on this very important study, The Missing Piece, the independent progress study on youth, peace and security, mandated by the Security Council for this resolution on YPS. And he has established a Young Peace Builders research network. Then we are going on to our second presentation by Dr. Sophia Shabab, my colleague and researcher at IDS. She works with the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development. And she's currently working alongside the University of Dohuk and the University of Mosul to facilitate young people from religious minorities in Iraq in the documentation and preservation of their heritage. Sophia did her PhD in social anthropology at Deakin University in Australia, and she spent over 10 years working with communities across the Middle East. And then we will go to our third presentation. Dr. Salvador Foquia is a researcher at the Institute for Social and Economic Studies in Maputo, Mozambique, and he's a senior lecturer at the Eduardo Mondlane University, also in Maputo. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Bordeaux in France, and his research focuses on state building, dynamics, and political violence. He's leading the research project on the state and violence and development challenges in northern Mozambique, and is currently based there for field research on the conflict in the north of Mozambique. So we're very pleased to have him here with us today. And I will introduce you to the two discussants after the three presentations. So Ali, the floor is yours, and I look forward to hear about your work.
Okay, thank you, Marioke, for putting this panel together, and also thank you, IDS, International Development Studies, for hosting this event. So in my presentation, I will problematize politics of, the political inclusion of young people, particularly when states promoting this idea through the multilateral system. So I'm an advocate for youth and peace building. I think everyone who knows me know that I'm very, very much into the youth, peace, and security agenda, but in this presentation, I will challenge the YPS agenda to move the field further, to move the YPS, youth, peace, and security field further. So until the adoption of Resolution 2250 in 2015, Security Council had a very limited interest in youth inclusion and participation. The subject of youth was mostly quite marginal in country level resolutions, highlighting the protection and employment needs of young people in disengagement, disarmament, and reintegration or post-conflict reconstruction processes. So less than a handful of resolutions suggested inclusion of young people in political processes contributes to peace and security. These country-level resolutions mainly focused on youth inclusion from an economic perspective and built direct link between youth employment with the reduction and prevention of violence. So in these resolutions, policy documents, youth employment was considered as a potential Achilles heel in any peace-building process, as the UN Secretary General's reports in 2010 framed it. Political participation and inclusion of young people rather gain importance with two institutional reform processes, in my perspective. So these two processes are, first one is the UN peacebuilding architecture, and the second one is the counterterrorism architecture. I am not going to go into details of the timelines of these institutional development processes, but I just want to attract your attention to the fact that both UN peacebuilding architecture and the counterterrorism architecture particularly grow at higher speed in post 9/11 period. So this is the period when risk and threat perceptions dominated by the fear and panic around terrorist acts. So after this side note, now I'm going back to the political participation discussion. Peace-building side of the UN started recognizing value of youth political inclusion with the start of Arab Spring protests. Youth political inclusion got some space in Security Council resolutions and Secretary General reports. These are mostly related to Yemen and Libya, and these developments were also largely rationalized by demographic factors, namely youth bulge. When we start speaking about when we look at to counter-terrorist side of the UN, we start seeing, counterterrorism architecture started seeing value in youth political inclusion when countering violent extremism framework was introduced to Security Council in 2014 with the resolution 2178. This resolution took a modest approach to youth inclusion and requested youth participation in developing strategies to counter violent extremism. when UN counterterrorism transform the CVE, countering violent extremism, into a broader framework that is prevention of violent extremism in 2015, youth political inclusion started gaining larger space in policy documents. Youth empowerment is one of the 6 priority areas of the UN Plan of Action to Prevention of Violent Extremism. So, counterterrorism architecture presumes politically disenfranchised and excluded young people as vulnerable to radicalization and recruitment of extremist armed groups, or at risk of committing terrorist attack due to violent extremist incitement on internet. So as a solution, counterterrorism side of the UN strangely posits a monocausal relationship between youth political inclusion and youth rejection of violent extremism, despite there is very weak evidence on this, and despite youth participation in violence historically had political relevance. For example, in recent years, counterterrorism experts in policy debates very often says that when we include young people in decision-making processes, we have seen decrease in violent extremism. I am not sure how they measure it, but I heard this phrase many times in recent months in policy debates. So, in short, all these efforts to enhance youth political inclusion and participation are simply built on the assumption that enhancing youth engagement in political life makes them less amenable and less likely to participate in violence, including extremist form of violence. Clearly, UN counterterrorism architecture approaches youth political participation through a securitization lens, which portrays absence of young people from formal politics or their involvement in politics that are distant from formal and controlled formal places as a threat or risk factor. So, I would like to mention few negative results in portraying or building this monocausal relationship between youth political participation and rejection of violent extremism. First, these approaches programmatize youth political participation. Despite most young people excluded from political spaces, we know that only a tiny fraction of young people participate in violence. So if we, for the sake of argument, if we assume that that tiny fraction of youth are involved or at risk of becoming involved in violence due to their exclusion from politics, then the question becomes whether offering opportunities for political engagement through projects, events, activities, or civic education trainings can satisfy the participation needs of young people and prevent their engagement from violence. So the question is mainly that would putting political participation into structured programs prevent the risk? In my opinion, it's extremely unlikely that such programs would satisfy, would identify actually, and recruit and fulfill political participation needs of young people. There are lessons learned from, particularly from youth employment programs, and we know this. Particularly Valeria Izzi's research show that youth employment programs designed to reduce youth participation violence serves only a tiny fraction of young people. And more importantly, when these programs are perceived, quoting here, perceived as privileging certain group of young people at the expense of others, they generate the risk of exacerbating conflict dynamics. So there's and now we have no evidence to suggest that dynamics will play out differently or in less harmful way for the programs that with the objective of youth political with the objective of fostering youth political engagement. And many young people who who I interviewed or listened to during my research spoke about how formal programmatized youth political participation through youth councils or other formal structures fosters nepotism, elitism, and tokenism. So only if the tiny fraction of youth population who may benefit from political inclusion programs are those at risk of becoming involved in violence due to their exclusion, then political inclusion programs may potentially reduce greater problems than they try to resolve. So the chance for successful targeting the right young people is very, very low. And the second problem, which I'm going to go explain about the problem of securitization here, is that securitization through counterterrorism is that it instrumentalized youth political participation for the legitimization of more expansive counterterrorism measures and to legitimize security actors' presence in security actors' questionable presence in youth spaces. Approaching youth political inclusion as a counterterrorism tool stigmatizes and alienates young people. And this is particularly the case for young people who do engage in politics outside of the sphere of counterterrorism. This was a sentiment that I heard, for example, in Europe, is that young people were speaking about security-related discussions that are only on violent extremism, devalue the impact of various forms of violence and security threats young people are concerned about. So such an instrumentalization of youth political inclusion for counterterrorism objectives push marginalized and excluded young people away from politics. So due to fears of instrumentalization and co-optation, many youth populations, particularly marginalized and excluded ones, avoid participation in formal spaces. So what happens is that mostly young people from elite backgrounds speak about marginalization and exclusion of their peers in these policy platforms. And then security actors, in the meantime, legitimize more broader counterterrorism measures through youth inclusion. And the third point that I would like to emphasize here that is the romanticization of youth political participation. There is no link between youth political inclusion and there is no strong link between youth political inclusion and their rejection of violent extremism. There's a body of research demonstrating that youth are more prone to violence than their peers who are not actively engaged in politics. Mercy Corps, for example, found that civically engaged youth are more supportive of armed opposition groups, not less. And then I just want to add that there's a larger, greater problem here, is that that's about the meaning of violence or the meaning associated with violence for young people. The assumption that youth political inclusion prevents youth engagement in violence leads us to fail to recognize, respect, and listen to the social, political, and cultural meanings attached to youth involvement in violence. So overall, there is a very complex relationship between multitude of factors determine whether fostering nonviolent youth political participation through formal mechanism is actually conflict sensitive and provides positive support to young people. So I'm going to just end now with few policy relevant discussion here. That there is recently we know that UN Security Council Resolution 2535 urged governments to protect civic and political spaces. However, the close connection between youth peace and security and counterterrorism agendas raises serious concerns since these measures, counterterrorism measures, have been globally the primary drivers of closing civic space. So when the motivation behind fostering youth political inclusion is tightly connected to counterterrorism objective of states, can the global YPS agenda foster youth political power outside of formal spaces? So I will end with this question. I know that Marioka is raising the red card for me, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali, for that contribution and a complex relationship indeed. Thank you for flagging the relationship being in the opposite direction than what we would think, or what our gut feeling tells us. And I can't help but notice the similarities with the overall debate on participation and governance that we've had for 4 decades, and also IDS research has been part of, about elite capture, about adverse incorporation, that when one does include young people, but it happens in a tokenistic way, it leads to fundamentally opposite effects than intended. And thank you also for pointing out that in the end, very few young people participate in violence, and the risk of instrumentalizing participation, while it is a fundamental right, not just for youth, but also for youth. So we're moving on swiftly to Sophia Shabab with her presentation on youth engagement and heritage in Iraq. The floor is yours, Sophia.
Thank you, Marioka. I'll just get my presentation up. Okay, so good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. Building on this idea of youth participation and peace building as multifaceted and topical, I'm going to speak today about a very specific example that illustrates informal youth engagement in relation to peace building and heritage. And while youth, heritage and peace building may seem somewhat strange bedfellows, I hope that through this example of the town of Bashiqa, that I'll be able to emphasize how heritage has been utilized by young people as part of forward-looking strategies to secure the future of their communities. So I'd like to first take you to the town of Bashiqa in northern Iraq, which sits between Mosul and the Kurdistan border. And prior to the arrival of Daesh, a majority of the population of Bashiqa was Yazidi, although there was also quite a sizable Christian population, as well as a small Muslim community living within the town. In 2014, following the genocide of the Yazidi population in Sinjar, the militant Islamist group known as ISIS or Daesh advanced from Mosul to take the neighboring towns of Bashiqa and Bazani. Having seen the atrocities and devastation wrought by Daesh in Sinjar, and with warning of their imminent arrival, the populations of these towns were forced to flee to the Kurdistan region of Iraq. During my research on the impacts and implications of the heritage destruction undertaken by Daesh on targeted communities in Iraq and Syria, I became closely acquainted with 4 Yazidi youth from Bashiqa: Aima, Fahem, Layla, and Samira. They were all in their late 20s and had returned to the town once it had been liberated from Daesh. They shared their histories, town, and communities with me and sent me photographs they had captured, documenting the destruction to which they had returned. And all of the photos that I'm showing in this presentation were shared with me by Aima. Through their accounts, I was able to explore the ways in which heritage was mobilized by Daesh as a mode of violence, and how Aima, Fahem, Layla, and Samira subsequently employed this heritage as a means of resistance, resilience, and peace. I don't really want to focus on the violence wrought by Daesh, but I think it's a little bit helpful to briefly detail some of this before I go on to explore the responses to it. So once they had captured Bashiqa, Daesh intentionally desecrated numerous Yazidi shrines and temples, as you can see from this photograph here, along with the churches that had been sites of worship for the Christian populations. Aima, Fahem, Layla, and Samira presented this heritage to me as embodying the identities of their communities, which contributed to a sense of belonging by rooting them in place. This was because it was in the temples that the practices that constituted Yazidi identity could be performed. At the same time, it was these practices that made the sites part of the heritage of their communities. Through the destruction of this heritage, the security of the social worlds they had established was demolished, and the sanctity of their home sphere of Bashiqa as a space of safety was violated. This was because the comfort created by the intimacy of familiarity with buildings, pathways, and peoples was ruptured through the destruction and displacement. As Samira explained to me, these sites are considered to the Yazidi community as archaeological sites and also spiritual sites. In there, the Yazidis bury their dead and visit their dead. Also, it is the place of their prayers to God. Also, it is a place to gather the people and to make the special ceremonies for the Yazidis. The shrines are all of that to Yazidis, so imagine the negative effects its destruction will leave on the community. In this way, Daesh intentionally weaponized heritage as a form of violence in order to inflict pain and tear apart communities. Along with the Yazidi temples and homes, Bashiqa also contained 3 churches that served the Christian population and were highlighted by Yazidi interlocutors as among the heritage of the town which had been destroyed by Daesh. In this photograph of the Syriac Catholic Church of the Virgin Mary, the damage depicted within the image was most likely the result of shelling by Peshmerga forces during the fighting to retake the town. This is because rather than merely destroying the church, Daesh repurposed it as what Aymar described as an al-Hizbah house. He told me that it is like a courthouse or judgment place where they bring people to judge them. So they transformed the church, which was a peaceful place meant to worship God and find peace and find forgiveness, to a place where you find power in punishing people. Total destruction of the material fabric of the building by Daesh was not necessary, as the reason these sites were destroyed was not because of their architectural value, but rather what they signified and how they worked to create communities. I'll now go on to talk more in depth about how the physical rehabilitation of heritage sites in Bashiqa was also employed by youth as a means of rebuilding their communities. This was both through the way that people came together during the rehabilitation process, as well as the way that once the rehabilitation was complete, the heritage of the town was used to facilitate, reconfigure, and restore a sense of community. The importance of the shrines and churches for the Yazidi and Christian communities in Bashiqa meant that they were among the very first buildings to be rehabilitated after the liberation from Daesh. This served as a means to assert their presence and as a public statement that they had not been defeated. It also functioned to restore the bonds between peoples of the town as they worked together and joined in celebrating religious rites and festivals. The emphasis on Yazidi and Christian heritage and communities was also a political means of asserting minority identities and claims to place over Arab, Kurdish, and Muslim. Aymar described how the community opted to privilege the rebuilding of the shrines and churches rather than people's houses, and this is a direct quote. What the community of Bashiqa did is to start building these shrines again as a message to Islamic State, we are still here and we still resist. So the shrines in Bashiqa have been built by the donation of the people of Bashiqa, not by the government or any NGOs. If you build the shrine, you are building a place or a thing for the whole town and for the whole people, because the shrine belongs to everybody in Bashiqa and not to a specific person in particular. That's why you can see all the people cooperate together to build the shrines, first to say that Bashiqa still belongs to minorities or Yazidis, and we start cleaning the church together to say the church will also stand in the town. By turning the Church of the Virgin Mary into a courthouse, Daesh altered the atmosphere of the site and sought to enact their power and presence in the community even after they had been defeated. However, rather than subduing those I spoke to, it further motivated them to erase traces of Daesh from Bashiqa. Fahan explained how groups of Yazidi and Christian youth mobilized in the cleaning of the town and renovation of the church, as this was important for the community in order to encourage people to return and to instill the hope that they could have a home again. He told me how we wanted to encourage people to come back and to give them spirit to motivate them for that by cleaning the city. This reflected experiences after the conflict in the Balkans and civil war in Spain, where refugees and displaced people did not return to their former towns and villages until rebuilding of significant heritage sites had occurred. Amidst a deficit of basic infrastructure, including shelter, water, and electricity, it may appear strange that heritage was such a significant factor. Yet the role of heritage in building identity, community, and place made it a priority for the youth from Bashiqa that I worked with during my research, as they sought to push back against historical, physical, and existential eradication. As a result, teams of about 18 young people, aged between 12 and 30 years old, contributed about 5,000 Iraqi dinar, which at the time was approximately $2 to $3 of their own money to buy the tools and hire a minivan to transport them to Bashiqa each weekend. There they worked over the course of 1 month to restore the Church of the Virgin Mary. And it was on the 15th of August 2017 that the first mass after Daesh was given in the church. This was a significant event for the community and was held alongside a festival for both Christian and Yazidis who attended the event. So drawing all of this together, in Bashiqa and among the youth who contributed to my research, there are a number of responses to the conflict and legacies of Daesh and their implications for everyday peace that I would like to point towards. This includes highlighting the tactics, strategies, and values of peace and action that they employed to foster humane relations, bridge differences, and counter structural violence through informal mechanisms. The rehabilitation of heritage in Bashiqa, most notably the restoration of the church, positioned youth as active agents in the future of their communities. Their heritage was not only representative of their past and the preserve of elites and elders, but was used by young people as a means of securing their future within the town and as ethno-religious minorities in Iraq. Some of the older Yazidis I spoke to lamented the cultural changes that they saw in Yazidi youth. For example, how they'd begun wearing the color blue, which is the color of the heavens and traditionally a sacred color within the Yazidi faith, and the shaving of their beards. However, young people's involvement in the rehabilitation of the shrines and churches and their participation in festivals emphasized their role as key stakeholders in the heritage of their communities. This gave them ownership over their heritage through the ability to choose which heritage they wanted to maintain and how they wanted to engage with it. The agency of those I spoke to was reinforced in and through the stories they chose to share with me and through their participation in my research. This was also a form of political activism through which they could shape perceptions and responses. Histories of persecution and displacement were embedded within the narratives I heard that presented the heritage of Bashiqa as significant in bearing witness to the Yazidi presence through the landscape. Talking about this heritage was therefore also a form of preservation that resisted the tangible destruction undertaken by Daesh, as well as what those I spoke to saw as attempts by Arab and Kurdish groups to lay claim to the town. As a result, it was a way for these youth to assert narrative control as they took on diplomatic roles in representing and speaking to me on behalf of their communities. There was a resistance to formal structures and institutions, such as NGO operations, as well as a distrust of Iraqi and Kurdish governments and their forces. This led those I worked with to privilege and emphasize internal mechanisms and structures with minimal external intervention. They described how Bashiqa and the Yazidi community had been abandoned by governments and international actors, all of whom had failed to protect those in Sinjar and left Bashiqa open to Daesh, even damaging its heritage in the fighting to reclaim it. This meant that these youth distanced themselves from their national identities as they no longer felt part of a broader Iraqi community. It was with anger that they saw the state as being willing to take from Yazidis, for example, by calling upon them to fight in the Iran-Iraq war, but not to assist their people or to protect their heritage when they were in need. Aymar, Faham, Layla, and Samira all described an increased distrust of Muslim communities resulting from the persecution they faced under Daesh. In emphasizing the bonds between Christians and Yazidis in Bashiqa and focusing on the heritage of these communities, there was therefore also a noticeable practice of exclusion. This was in relation to the Muslims who had previously lived within the town, many of whom had also fled with the arrival of Daesh. This reconfigured the boundaries of Bashiqa with regards to those who were seen to belong and overrode histories of collaboration. This meant that to create a sense of security and stability among Yazidi interlocutors, Muslim populations were repositioned as strangers and a threat to the social and religious life of the town. In this way, heritage has been deployed both as a source of violence and as part of strategies for peace that may not encompass an idealized vision that preaches wholesale acceptance, but which enables resilience and a sense of security and regeneration among the youth who collaborated in my research. And this final picture on this slide was just sent to me on Friday by Amar as he was in Bashiqa that night celebrating the Tawafat celebrations, where young people and members of the community would gather together as part of the festivities and have picnics throughout the evening and the celebrations. So I just wanted to share with you that recent example of the young people engaging in their heritage and their practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Beautiful pictures, really beautiful presentation, and connecting this to what Ali said about the talk of youth participation in these formal spaces, and you showing the opposite of young people actually rejecting some of the formal institutions and wanting to do it on their own in their own spaces that they've created, and rebuilding community, not just the shrines and those places that are important. That's really fascinating. We're moving on swiftly to Salvador Forquilla for his presentation on northern Mozambique.
Thank you so much, Marioke. Sorry, I can't share my screen. Can you?
We'll give you host rights.
Yeah, the host, yeah. Just. Yeah, no, I can't. Can you please?
We can also do it for you.
Yeah, please. Yeah. Okay.
Try it now, Salvador.
Okay, let me try. No, not yet.
No, Rachel, can you step in? And then Salvador, you can just tell us when to, there we go, there's your presentation. You tell us when to change pages, yeah?
Yes, please. Okay. So good afternoon and many thanks for having me here. My presentation is on insurgency dynamics in northern Mozambique and the youth issue. And it is based on extensive fieldwork that we have conducted at the Institute for Social and Economic Studies, YES, over the last 3 years under the research project on state violence and development challenges in northern Mozambique. In the 3.5 years, Mozambique has been facing a jihad insurgency. The insurgency articulates itself around a religious discourse. It explores and mobilizes different tensions that exist at local level, namely social, political, economic, and religious tensions. And over time, the insurgency has become increasingly linked to the global terrorism. Next slide, please. Yeah. So my presentation will focus on 4 main points. I will firstly start by giving some elements of the context related to political discourse and the practice on youth since Mozambique independence in 1975. Secondly, I will discuss the factors that explain the spread of the insurgency in northern Mozambique. Thirdly, I will look into radical cells and the recruitment process. And then fourthly, I will give some elements to conclude my presentation. Next slide, please. So I put my argument as follows, as can you see in this slide. While it is true that the youth are the main target of the recruitment process and play a crucial role in the reproduction of violence, the measures, the insurgency in northern Mozambique cannot be reduced to a mere question of youth and multiple factors at play, including religious factors. Next slide, please. So with regard to context, The youth issue has always been in the discourse and practice of the political elite since independence in 1975. During the revolution era, just after independence, the youth was referred to as lifeblood of the nation. In this context, the youth political participation was associated to the idea of revolution through Mozambique Youth Organization, and during through the National Youth Council and the political parties' youth leagues. In terms of policies, different youth policies and strategies have been issued, but these policies and strategies fail to tackle the youth problems. Next, please. So over the last 50 years, the youth have been actively participating in different armed conflicts in Mozambique for different reasons. So the question here is, to what extent the youth are linked to the jihad insurgency in northern Mozambique? So this question takes me to the second point of my presentation, which is the spread of the insurgency. Next slide, please. So when local religious leaders initially complained to the government authorities about the existence of a group of young people who were creating disturbances in mosques and preaching a different Islam, it is highly likely that few people could imagine that these young agitators were beginning a new cycle of complex armed violence in Mozambique, attacking not only state institutions, but also local populations, causing a major humanitarian crisis. Perhaps that is why when the attack started in 2017, the Mozambican authorities regarded the phenomenon as a common banditry comparable to a simple phenomenon of public order disturbance. However, over time, the phenomenon became much more complex. The religious sect that emerged in the years 2010, focusing on Cabo Delgado districts with ramifications in neighboring provinces, Nampula and Niassa, turned into a military movement with jihadist characteristics. So the question is, what factors could have caused the phenomenon to evolve? Why was it not confined to Mocimboa da Praia, which is a small town where the attack started in 2017? So field research suggests that various explanatory factors exist. Although linked for my discussion, I group these factors into two categories, which are category, and the second one, which is institutional. I will start by the first context. Next slide, please. Okay. Yeah, so in the specific case of Northern Mozambique, when we speak about contextual factors, we are talking about social, economic, and political conditions to the emergence and the expansion of the insurgents, namely the feeling of ethnic, social, economic, and political exclusion. This feeling exploited and mobilized by the insurgents. So these conditions led to the making of an anti-state narrative, which acted as a catalyst for the adherence of young people to the group through a complex recruitment mechanism that beyond the borders of Mocimboa da Praia and even Cabo Delgado. To this, there are other contextual factors associated with regional conflicts in northern Mozambique that contributed to advance of the insurgents on the ground, namely the existence of an organized crime network with cross-borders ramification operating an illicit economy through a variety of trafficking operations. Secondly, porous borders, particularly with Tanzania, which facilitated a strong migratory movement associated with illegal mining and poaching. Thirdly, the existence of an electronic and informal money transfer mechanism that allows fast and efficient payments, such as M-Pesa, M-Spring, M-Cash, or even Awala system. This payment mechanism made it possible to boost the recruitment process. And finally, when Islamic State entered the scene, particularly from mid-2019, it brought better trained and more experienced foreign fighters, sophisticated weaponry, and comprehensive propaganda mechanisms, which increased the international visibility of the insurgency in northern Mozambique. So we have other category of factors, which I call institutional factors. Next slide, please. So when it comes to institutional factors, I look at the institutional factor as being associated with the way institutions work and shape the outcome of the state's efforts to contain the insurgents. In this respect, I would like to highlight 4 factors. Firstly, the state's inappropriate response, at least at the beginning of the insurgents, with mass arrests, the closure of the mosques, and human rights violations. In this context, the state's action helped to reinforce the schism in its relationship with local population and to feed the anti-state narrative built and disseminated by Al-Shabaab, not just in Mocimboa da Praia, but also in other districts of Cabo Delgado, Nampula, and Niassa. The second factor is internal division at the highest level of the ruling party, which is Frelimo. This prevented, at least in the beginning, the creation of a clear and shared common vision of the armed conflict and strategies for the action on the ground. The third factor is little insertion of elements of the defense and security forces in the field. And finally, the fourth factor is difficulty on the part of defense forces elements in the field in understanding clearly, at least at the beginning of the insurgency, the Operation Command Center. So there were 2 commands coming, one from the Ministry of Home Affairs and the other one from the Ministry of Defense. So although Cabo Delgado is the epicenter of the insurgency, interviews on the ground show that its dynamics also extend to other regions in the northern part of Mozambique, such as Nampula and Niassa. So in what way? Through attempts to install religious radical cells and the recruitment of young people to fight in the areas directly affected by armed conflict in Cabo Delgado. Next slide, please. So before the first attack on Mocimboa da Praia in 2017, there was already evidence that there were radical religious cells in some districts of Nampula and Niassa. And with the outbreak of the armed violence, the cells became important for recruitment to the ranks of the insurgents in Cabo Delgado. It is interesting to note how the establishment of these cells is very similar to what happened in Cabo Delgado. First, we have religious cells which are established, and then later on, military cells. Our interviews show that the religious cells were established by Tanzanians or Mozambicans, especially young Mozambicans who attended Salafi mosques in Tanzania. When these people arrived in northern Mozambique, they first sought to penetrate the local mosques. In all cases, they encountered resistance from local Muslims religious leaders, both the Islamic Council of Mozambique and the Islamic Congress of Mozambique. So as a result, they decided to build their own places of worship, so local other mosques, and resistance on the part of religious leaders was accompanied by denunciation to local authorities. So in areas where the group was able to establish religious cells with a radical tendency, they began to function as important recruitment hotspots, trying to recruit young people into the ranks of Al-Shabaab in districts of Cabo Delgado. So how did this recruitment take place? Next slide, please. So what we have as evidence from the ground suggests that members of the Al-Shabaab group do not come solely from Cabo Delgado. The dynamics associated with evolution of violence has enabled Al-Shabaab to install a vast and complex recruitment network that has made it possible to incorporate combatants not only from abroad, but also from different parts of Mozambique. And the growing literature on extremist movements, for example, in Africa, agrees in considering that the recruitment process is not uniform, as there are different in the way, there are differences in the way different jihadist groups recruit. For example, in their comparative work on Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab from Somalia, Omena, Hendricks, and Ajayi Billy stress that the two groups, Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab from Somalia, they favor different recruitment strategies reflecting the political configuration of the countries where they operate. Next slide, please. In the case of northern Mozambique, our interview suggests that Al-Shabaab explored local social, economic, political, and religious dynamics for recruitment purposes, focusing on various aspects such as local religious divisions within Islam, ethnic divisions, instrumentalization of the anti-state Frelimo narrative, microcredit schemes to boost small business for future recruits, promise of employment in the Cabo Delgado fishing sector, and in mining and other activities. Next slide, please. In many cases, these incentives for recruiters are based essentially on two aspects: high wages, which are believed to exist in Cabo Delgado, and the possibility of better living conditions. Concerning the target group, the recruitment process focuses mainly on young people, especially those living in a very vulnerable condition with no jobs or prospects. Next slide, please. In this circumstance, the Al-Shabaab structure their recruitment discussed by manipulating not only religious factors, but also opposition to state. And our interviews show that Al-Shabaab recruitment strategy in northern Mozambique are essentially based on the dynamics of the local context, making recruitment a contextually determined phenomenon. And to conclude, next slide, please. I just wanted to emphasize two main ideas. Firstly, the insurgency in northern Mozambique is not an exclusively youth-motivated phenomenon. It is important to look into multiple factors that push young people to join the insurgents, including religious factors. And secondly, any attempt to solve the conflict needs to take into account seriously the youth issue. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Salvador. Thank you for such a detailed presentation on the many drivers of conflict in this region. And so I think what your presentation really illustrates is that you can't, if the conflict drivers are so multiple and so complex, then a conflict cannot be reduced to a youth-driven conflict, as you show so much of the deeper causal structures. For the sake of time, we're going quickly to our discussants, who I will introduce, and they will give some reflections, and then we open the floor to some questions, which the audience can now start typing in. So it's my pleasure to introduce Shadi Rushabaz, who is an Iranian peace builder and facilitator and trainer. She has a double master degree in inter-Mediterranean migration and mediation. Her work focuses on youth, peace and security in the MENA region and intersectionality specifically. She's worked with several international organizations and for the UN as well, and for civil society organizations and the Council of Europe. And Shadi, can I invite you to offer your reflections first?
Thank you so much for having me, and I'd like to thank our amazing panelists today. So much that I've learned in such a short period of time, and of course there's so much. Okay, the echo is gone. So I made a couple of notes as we were speaking. I would like to start with my immediate reflections on what Ali has shared. As a young activist myself, I see this sort of pattern that any sort of access to political spaces or political decision making, political inclusion, is a sort of a vicious circle. So there are certain elite young people who are engaged in the civic spaces, and these young people are more recognized by institutions. And to stick to Ali's presentation, I would like to, for now, frame these institutions as government or as local authorities. And because they are more recognized and they sort of either consciously or unconsciously form the elite, they are more pushed to political activism, and they basically replicate the system. So you have a circle of the same group of elite young people being recycled through different national councils, different parts of the government, and wherever basically they can have can find a room to enter. I see this quite often in our region, in MENA region, where there's a lot of, always a lot of discussions about corruption, about nepotism, and elitism and stuff as such. So that was my initial reaction that I thought that I found highly relevant. But this also brings me to a more important question, which maybe Ali could give us some reflections about later on. And that question is, having described counterterrorism in a more detailed way today for us, Ali, I would like to know, especially as a young person, but also as a young activist, what do you think is the negative impact of counterterrorism on youth participation in general? So both at the political level and also at the civic space, because if you have already shed a lot of light on it at the political level, then it would be very justifiable to discuss a bit more on the civic, let's say, level, given that young people's activism is very much important in the civic spaces. And that brings me to my brief reflections on Sophia's presentation, if I may, which was very interesting to listen, given that I'm from Iran and I do have a bit of a country history with Iraq. And there are quite similar dynamics and of course very different dynamics there. For Sophia, my initial thoughts were, I think the only form of, let's say, inaction or political passivity is the lack of participation. So the very fact that the participants in your research, the community that you worked with, were engaged in a sort of heritage building, or rather heritage rebuilding process, clearly demonstrates their will to be politically to be political participants and to be politically participating in a statement, rather that you also spoke of double marginalization within their own community, but also within the violence that they have suffered from ISIS or from Daesh, in other words. My thoughts, rather, initially I had a lot of thoughts about this presentation because I feel much closer and more concretely, in experience with and synchronization with what this group have been doing. So my question here would be, do you ever fall across people, or specifically young people in these communities, who are afraid or who were not willing to join their peers in this process of rebuilding cultural heritage, whether this is because they would be ostracized by their families or by their community, or they would simply be afraid of what authorities could think of this statement of political, let's say, action, even if it's under the channel of cultural heritage. I think I'll stop here to be mindful of time, and I will pass it over to Cecile.
Thanks. Thank you, Shadi. Thanks so much. Thanks for thorough listening. I'll give the speakers time to process and come up with an answer, and Cecile can offer her reflections next. So pleased to introduce Cecile Mazakurati, who works with the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, where she's in charge of the Youth, Peace and Security agenda, as well as peace-building issues at large. And Cecile is also the co-chair of the Global Coalition on Youth, Peace and Security, which is a multi-stakeholder global platform, which is co-led by the Search for Common Ground and the United Nations Young Peace Builders. And Cecile has worked for nearly 20 years with the United Nations in various positions, including on health, gender and youth in humanitarian and peace-building settings. So ample experiences to help us make these connections between three diverse presentations and these bigger policy questions and agendas. Cecile, very pleased to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you, IDS, for organizing this panel. Thank you to our three panelists and to Shadi for all these really insightful and interesting points. There's so much to discuss from there. I just want to reflect on a few points. I think first, the different presentations really illustrated the multiple and diverse way young people are engaged and related to peace and security issues. And I really was interested to hear in Sophia's presentation the question of heritage as core to peace and as a way for young people, as an issue that young people engage around. I think it's something we hear very little about, and that is, we tend to think about peace and peace building as these, formal, very political processes. But what we see here, I think it was a really interesting illustration of how this is not at all just that. This is much more diverse, informal, entirely self-started and self-sustained very often. It also reminded me that in many contexts, and I don't know, Sophia and Salvador in particular, if that's true in the context you work in, the word peace builder actually doesn't mean anything, or maybe doesn't exist, doesn't translate, and certainly is not something that young people identify to. And Shadi and Ali, you might remember that when we all were together a few years ago doing consultations for the progress study on youth, peace and security, we heard that very often from young people, that we from the international side, we frame them as peace builders, but that's not their experience, that's not their identity. So I thought that was really interesting. And Salvador's presentation reminded us, I think, how the reasons why some young people, always a minority, but why some young people engage in violence continue to be little understood. And there's a lot of ready-made explanations that are put on a situation, a specific situation, on specific contextual factors, ready-made explanations around employment very often, and a misunderstanding of more profound inequalities and drivers that lead, again, some young people to violence, which therefore leads to misguided reinsertion program and inadequate prevention measures, and overall an analysis and a discourse, often at the national and at the international level, that actually is disconnected from the reality and from the experience of people. I think this is also good. Salvador's presentation was also a good reminder that we are still in the post 9/11 world, and Ali mentioned that in his presentation. And 9/11 really gave a new inspiration to this century-long perception of young people, and particularly young men, as a threat. And it gave it this new framing, which was young Arab men as a threat. And I think there's a lot that we could also discuss. Actually, I would be interested in Shadi's perception and reflection on that. The Arab Spring, yes, both shed a light on how young people mobilize to change corrupt political regimes, but also very much reinforce this idea as young people as a threat, and young people as troublemakers, and young people as, throwing things away, and how do we manage young people? Which then leads us to the question of international policy frameworks. And I very much agree with Ali's analysis around the youth, peace and security agenda basically being born out of these opposite forces and dynamics, which is the evolution of the peace building architecture, but very much so the growing counterterrorism discourse, again, in the wake of 9/11. And if you look at resolution 2250, so the first resolution on youth, peace and security, which was adopted in 2015, it actually is a schizophrenic resolution. It has all this language around young people as building peace and positive contributors. And as Ali said, it was the first time the Security Council said that, but it also has all this language on violent extremism, actually from the first paragraph of the resolution, all these references to counterterrorism, these references to youth employment being a priority intervention, etc. So it's the perfect incarnation of these contradictory forces. And in my view, recent resolutions on youth, peace and security, and particularly resolution 2535, which was adopted last summer by the Council, really have shown an evolution and a capacity. Actually, it's the Youth, Peace and Security agenda was able to shed away some, at least, of the counterterrorism and CVE discourse. And so this resolution, in particular, the last one, 2535, is much more deeply inscribed into the peacebuilding agenda. It references the peacebuilding agenda. Of course, there's still a little bit of violent extremism and counterterrorism here and there, but it's like the agenda has been able to pull away a bit from the forces of counterterrorism. That doesn't come without its own risks, as Ali also reminded us, and the romanticization of young people is also very damaging. I mean, suddenly we're talking, the problem in international discourse is that we're talking about an abstract. So we have the young peace builders, or we have the youth as violent. Who are these young people? The young people are so much more than that, and they are from different regions, and they, and all these young people we so little talk about. Young people from various ethnic backgrounds, young people, different gender identities, etc. So I very much agree that the romanticization, I mean, even though I prefer that to the demonization of young people, still is going to misguide what the international community, the United Nations, international NGOs, government, etc., are going to do, because then it also leads, yes, to this projectization approach. Let's do this little project with young people. We'll give them an opportunity to discuss, etc., and it takes the discussion away from the real issue, which is really power dynamics and how political systems function. Because what young people want, and again, that's what we heard repeatedly when we were doing the research for the progress study on youth, peace and security, was that young people don't want to be included in corrupted system. They want this corrupt system to change. So it's not about a side little project, but it's about going into question governance systems. Thank you.
Thanks, Cecile. Yes, like you, I also heard a lot about the disconnect, the tension between peace building and counterterrorism, and then what happens in one dominates the other. So I think Salvador's presentation, as soon as ISIS or Daesh came into the picture, which agenda is going to dominate into what is into the response. Okay, I'm going to give the speakers a chance to quickly reply to the discussants. Please keep it succinct to give each other enough time. I also want to flag that among the questions that were sent by the audience, one resonates with Cecile's comment about the focus on counterterrorism leading to a focus on young male. So what is happening to young women? Ali, would you have a minute to respond, and then Sophia.
Just to that question or all of them?
To the discussants.
Okay. Okay, so I think about the gender issue, yes, there is a gender pattern here where young man is being portrayed as threat, and young woman is more of experience a different sort of securitization, being as victimized. And what happened there is that both actually experience surveillance afterwards, particularly in civic spaces. I want to also, if it's in 30 seconds, I want to respond to the question around in the chat about the Al-Shabaab and how this interacts with youth empowerment. I think the way who answers this question is really matters. I mean, we need to. This is a lot about research, in my opinion, is that if we build methods with the counterterrorism that we can speak to young people who join extremist armed groups, and that becomes a major problem for us to actually analyze correctly why young people join extremist armed groups, but we are creating a lot of narratives about them. And I just want to say, UNDP's research from Journey to Extremism, if you look at it, we see that when young people are consulted, they say that government's action is the primary reason why they at first place join in violent extremist armed groups. So I will just leave it there.
Thanks. Moving to Sophia to respond to discussants.
So very briefly responding to Shadi's question about sort of whether there's any sort of fear around the rebuilding of heritage or youth participation in that. Not that I encountered. It was very much a form of resistance that they wanted to be explicit about, that this is their land. It's very much politicized in that dialogue, and they had the support of their communities in doing that to quite a large degree. Where there was some resistance was actually in the formal structures and institutions of those heritage sites, or of the church in particular. So there's a reason why they restored one of the churches, but they didn't actually get permission from the church hierarchies to work on the rehabilitating of the other churches. And I think that was to do with the church structures and how it functions as an institution, rather than kind of local resistance. But there was also a little bit of resistance from one of the interlocutors around participating in the research, so that her family wouldn't know, and lending her voice to the research. And there's potentially a gender dimension in there. But yeah, she very much wanted our interactions to be kept secret, to be kept private. And then peacebuilding as a term wasn't one that they would use or see themselves as at all. They were building their community, but their community as they saw it, which was inclusive of the Christians and Yazidis, but not of the Muslims. So in that sense, they're trying to establish safety and security, but that wasn't necessarily in what people might see as working towards a positive peace, in that sense. So thank you.
Thank you, Sophia, for that reply. Salvador, could you reply to the broader discussants, but also the question about securitization being gendered was also addressed to you. So the focus is so very much on young male. We saw a lot of young males in the pictures on your presentation. So could you also speak to the gender dimension?
Thank you so much. I think that the gender dimension is present, although it's not very much visible. And what we can see from our research, for example, young women, they participate, for example, in the insurgency, but they have very specific roles in the insurgency, especially with regard to the collecting information in the villages, and then give that information to the insurgents so that the insurgents can operate militarily. And but also they have other roles, very much domestic roles, linked to cooking and helping the fighters, the combatants. And but as I mentioned, the face, I would say, of women is not very much visible, because when we talk about insurgents, at least in northern Mozambique, very often we think of young men who are there and fighting and involved in violence. But I have two comments on two aspects. The first one, the question on why young people join extremist groups. And this is one of the questions we have been researching as well. And in our case, we can't talk about just one reason. And we have several reasons. We have several motivations. And that's why I was saying that unemployment, for example, cannot be taken as the main reason why young people join the insurgency. Because, for example, at the very beginning, what we have seen is young people, for example, selling what they had in order to join the insurgency. So there is also kind of probably the ideological element, ideological aspect linked to the religion, which has to be taken into account, because it's not only just unemployment or poverty. And because we have poverty everywhere, I would say, in Mozambique, but even in northern Mozambique, but not only young people living in poverty, they join necessarily the extremist groups. And the second aspect I would like to comment on is about the need to stress the diversity of young people. So when we talk about young people is not kind of homogeneous reality. We have, as I think Cecile mentioned correctly, I mean, we have different backgrounds and people coming from different, even religious realities. For example, very often we think that the Al-Shabaab in northern Mozambique are composed of Muslim young people. That's true, but we can also find inside the group people coming from Christian background, for example. So I think that it's from policy point of view, it's very important to keep in mind that we young people is not an homogeneous reality, and we have different backgrounds when it comes to young people. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I would like to know, we have, while we're waiting for more questions to come in, I was wondering if you see this tension entirely also in the architecture of the responses. So there is the CVE and the preventing extremism architecture and the peace build. Where are the connections? Where is the dialogue possible? Where, if we really want to push debates further, where do we see some of the connections? How do these two very different families that have different civil societies around them, where do we see opportunities for making connections, as there is this big disconnect? Where and in terms of, even within the peace building community, we can see the disconnect between the formal and the informal, and what can the formal platforms learn from those informal engagements that Sophia has talked about, as these are also expressions of political agency. I'm also inviting the discussants to join in the discussion. And Shadi had her hand up, I think. Yes, please go ahead.
So I sort of anticipated this coming somehow, but I think the first point that I wanted to bring up was the discussion of romanticization, because somehow as a young peace builder, I feel like violence is not supposed to be, part of my DNA. Like, I am not allowed to respond to things that are extremely violent to me with violence, because I'm better than that, and because I am greater. I choose the way of peace, and then at the end of the day, when you're sitting privately reflecting, you think, okay, but that is nonviolent resistance, nonviolent communication. All of these are ways that you choose, but at the end of the day, violence itself is a sort or a form of self-expression, and specifically in situations where no other sort of activism, participation, there is basically no other way to express yourself. And this has been something that I'm reflecting a lot on, and it's been coming as this using this term of peace builder. It's specifically a term that when you enter this field, you pick to identify as brings an external pressure, I would say, on young people's work. And it sometimes can cause a barrier to their creativity or to the informal ways that young people choose to continue their form of activism. I think one thing that institutions should be more aware of as a young peace builder, as a person, as an individual, is not to hegemonize or institutionalize. For everything we have a capacity development program, for everything we have learning, and then all of these are great ideas. There is no end to learning, there is no end to knowledge and to information and to skills. But what Sophia was presenting, I don't think those young people had capacity development workshops in building mosques or churches in their community. It was something that happened very organically in a bottom-up way. Whereas I know, and I have also been part of many of these amazing and very rich activities, which were set up, of course, by institutions, and we're looking for inspirational or promising young people to attend. And it did benefit me a lot, but this doesn't mean that that's the only way to proceed. And one thing that Salvador brought up, which I found particularly inspiring, is that there is a no one fits all solution or verdict in anything that we do in our sector. None for gender, none for inclusion, none for peace building. Every case is different, and this is a bit of a bad news, because that means there has to be more work to be done. There has to be more analysis for every case to be done. But what I think institutions or political parties, local authorities, they should learn from bottom up, or let's say young people's ways of informal work, is to stop a little bit institutionalizing and rather listen and be more open and welcome to creative and inclusive ways. And these are just some primary reflections that I was having.
Thanks very much. Does anyone want to respond on this topic? Because there's a different question to Salvador on a different topic. If there was anyone who had reactions to this, Ali or Cecile, Sophia. Ali, I think.
Yeah, I kind of, your previous, the question you asked about like how this could move in the architecture related, the international multilateral system related question. So I'm not going to speak about multilateral system, but I will say that what is needed to move that system further in the more appropriately towards more appropriate youth empowerment and inclusion, I think is that I think we kind of like treating like youth empowerment in the discourse there as like as one thing. It's that all of them are the same. No, there is a big diversity in the way that young empowerment programs work, and I think we need to kind of question like how particularly securitized approaches subsume youth idea of youth political participation, power of youth political participation in civic spaces to their resilience against violent extremism. And it may make young people resilient to violent extremism, for example, but what are the counterproductive impacts of that? We need to kind of question it. And I think another point, I think, for moving the policy forward is that we need to look at like, what does it mean to do youth empowerment programs when someone claims that it's human rights-based approach? What is the evidence on this? What is the monitoring and evaluation on the human rights implication of this? There's very, very little to find in documents, in reporting in those areas. So I think that has to be kind of questioned. And I think to make this more properly, I will also say one thing about partnership. Is the way partnerships are being built in the way top-down policy frameworks go have an impact on the lives of young people. We need to look at the way how young people are being kind of collaborating with the international actors. It usually goes through the oversight of governments, where actually international actors need to take the risk of partnering young people in empowering them in their relationship with governments. And that's a very tricky and risky exercise for international organizations, but they need to start like kind of really investing in that, building that type of relationship and support structures, rather than just putting conferences and like kind of defining inclusion in conference rooms or in hotel rooms. So I will leave it here. Thank you.
Yes, Cecile, you have 1 minute.
Yes, just very briefly to say that one of the, I think, big threats of the counterterrorism and CVE approach to young people has been, and women, you could argue is the same thing, has been to promote their participation as a tool of counterterrorism and countering violent extremism, which is basically de facto often aiming to turn civil society into informants and to raise the alarm on their own communities. And I think that's highly, highly problematic. And the other thing I wanted to say is that there is, in that sense, a bit of a commonality with the peace-building agenda, which is to see youth participation as a mean to another end, and not just as a fundamental right. And that's the whole danger of the efficiency argument about, you need to engage women or young people, because that way peace will hold, peace will be sustained, etc. But also just because it's a right. And so how to keep that focus on human rights, I think, is fundamental for both agendas.
Thank you very much. There was a question about human rights, which I'm going to ask Sophia to, if you could, that someone asked about the role of transitional justice and human rights in these contexts. And would you be able to relate that to your research setting in Iraq? After the question for Salvador, so you have a moment to think. Salvador, someone asked about the military intervention in Mozambique. So we handle those two very more specific questions, and then we'll wrap up. Salvador first.
Thank you very much, Mariotti. Military intervention is one of the, I would say, most discussed issue at the moment in Mozambique with regard to the insurgency. In my opinion, SADC military intervention is not the solution, not just because it's SADC, even if it could be EU, United States, UK, whatever. So foreign military intervention, I don't think could be the solution. Of course, it's important to counter military action of the insurgents, but I don't think at the moment that SADC military intervention could be the solution. In terms of implication, of course, it will weaken, I would say, government legitimacy. It will not bring a kind of added value to the whole process of solving the problem. What I think is that what
I think he froze right at the end. Mm-hmm. Okay, Salvador, we always send questions by PDF after the webinar, so let's finish that question in writing. Sophia, I'm going to hand you the last minute and then we close the session.
Yeah, I mean, so particularly with the Yazidis, the issue of transitional justice and human rights is a huge one. And if I were to relate it to heritage in that context in particular, I think there needs to be more recognition about how heritage feeds into that idea of freedoms of religious beliefs, or whether people have no religion, and enabling those practices to occur. Because the reason a lot of these sites are destroyed isn't because they're tangible physical buildings of architectural value, it's because of the practices that happen within them. So it's enabling those people and communities to continue those practices through displacement, through rebuilding processes, and taking away the barriers that would prevent those groups, especially the Yazidis, for example, to engage in their religious and heritage practices. And that could be even through formal institutional heritage groups that might say rebuilding has to occur in a particular way, and that can put barriers to people engaging in their heritages if they can't rebuild these sites quickly to regain that sense of community again. And also as a barrier to the youth also engaging in those practices and engaging in these community mechanisms as well.
Thank you so much. So that brought us to the end of the session. Thank you all speakers and discussants for these very different, diverse presentations, which really helped us think about, like question, what is youth participation in context of peace and security? Because we use the same words, but we can mean very different things at very different scales. I think all presentations and the discussants very clearly address this gap, or the missing middle between the skills, the levels, as well as between the peace building and the counterterrorism work that has been going on, as well as between the formal and the informal forms of youth engagement in peace and security. So thank you so much for thought-provoking presentations and comments. Thank you in the audience. You will receive a link to the recording, the PDF of PowerPoints, and any of the questions that were not yet answered, we will answer in writing. I hope you will join us for the next webinar, which is on the 30th of May on rural livelihoods in sub-Saharan Africa, which will also be a book launch of a new book that IDS published, and together with Include, the knowledge platform for inclusive development. Thank you very much, and I wish you a nice rest of the day.
Thank you.